The July Monarchy. So the July Monarchy was a constitutional monarchy under King Louis Philippe I following the July Revolution of 1830 that overthrew the Bourbon King Charles X, and then key features of the monarchy include power shifting to the bourgeoisie, an increase in industrialization and economics, as well as always, general social discontent among different classes. And so, for a little bit of historical context, after Napoleon was ousted in 1814, the Bourbon dynasty was restored to power, marking the beginning of the Bourbon Restoration, where conservative policies as well as the Roman Catholic Church were reestablished as political forces. Despite the return to the regime, though, France had undergone significant changes during the Revolution, such as economic shifts favoring urban merchants, as well as Napoleon's administrative reforms, which did create a more centralized government that remained in place. And so, under Louis XVIII's rule, he faced pressures from the ultra-royalists to oppose the constitutional monarchy and sought to reverse revolutionary changes. Fearing a popular uprising, he disbanded the chamber dominated by the Altas, but restored it after the assassination of Duke Berry in 1820, and so they regained their power and implemented more reactionary policies. Upon Louis's death in 1824, Charles X took the throne, as well as a more conservative stance than his brother, which included curbing press freedoms, restoring aristocratic privileges, and reasserting the church's power. This all led to widespread content, culminating in the July 1830 Revolution. And so the July Revolution of 1830 in France was a 3-day uprising against King Charles X's increasingly authoritarian rule. It was also known as the Trois Glorieux, or the Three Glorious Days. And so during this time, France was experiencing economic hardships, including rising food prices, unemployment, and general poverty, and many felt that Charles was out of touch with the people's struggles. In addition, his restoration of aristocratic privileges frustrated the bourgeoisie and the working class, who had lost social power with this change in leadership. Upon hearing upon Charles' 4 ordinances, which restricted the liberties of the working class and further established nobility, the unemployed, students, and middle-class citizens took to the streets with both barricades as well as street fighting. This revolution, led by liberal forces, resulted in Charles X's abdication and the rise of Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, who became the King of the French, under a more constitutional monarchy, marking the end of the Bourbon Restoration. So for a bit about Louis-Philippe, he was born into the House of Orleans, which was an outer branch of the Bourbon family, so he did have some royal blood within him. His tutorage influenced liberal thought, and in later years he had joined the Jacobin Club. And then in April 1792, he joined the Revolutionary Army and performed extremely well, causing him to rise through the ranks. However, when his father was arrested in April 1793, he feared political tensions, and upon his general defecting, he defected with his general, though they separated. He then traveled through Europe for some time before fleeing to America. In 1809, he was welcomed back to Europe, but he remained cautious about participating in French politics under Napoleon. Upon Napoleon's defeat, he then sought to reconcile with the reigning Louis XVIII, but the return of the conservative regime left him politically marginalized as he leaned towards liberal Orleans learnings. Nevertheless, though, his reputation as a moderate and his connections with the French middle class and liberal factions grew. Throughout the 1820s, he cultivated relationships with key liberal figures in France, positioning himself as a champion of the constitutional monarchy and the interests of the bourgeoisie. His Orleanist branch was seen as a more progressive alternative to the conservative Bourbons, which made him a prime candidate for the leadership when the July Revolution erupted. The Charter of 1814, which mimicked that of a constitution signed by Louis XVIII, was revised upon Louis Philippe's reign, establishing him as King of the French rather than King of France, and so this was significant because this lifted the principle of national sovereignty over the principle of divine right. And then, upon his new reign, he created the Charter of 1830, which was a compromise between the Doctrinaires' opposition to Charles X and the Republicans. Its differences included repealing laws that enforced Catholicism and censorship, as well as re-establishing the revolutionary tricolor flag, which is now France's iconic flag. Additionally, he repealed several unpopular laws implemented by the 2 former kings, not limited to the 4 ordinances, the 1825 Anti-Sacrilegious Act, as well as imposing budget restrictions on the Catholic Church. Upon his ascension to the throne, he now had to tame the forces that had lifted him up there. Some of Louis Philippe's first acts included adopting the arms of the House of Orleans as state symbols, hosting a parade of the National Parisian Guard, and providing financial compensation for those injured during the Revolution. However, despite this, he still struggled to tame the public, especially when faced with the 1831 riots centered around political and religious friction. During Louis Philippe's reign, France continued to expand its colonial empire, with the conquest of Algeria being the most significant effort, as it gave France access to a vast supply of raw materials and agricultural products. French forces engaged in brutal campaigns to establish control over Algeria, and this started in about 1830. Colonial expansion was seen as a way to both strengthen France's global influence as well as an opportunity for economic exploitation. However, these efforts drained national resources and faced internal opposition from anti-imperialist voices. Despite the colonialism and domestic discontent, though, the July monarchy forged strong ties with Britain through the Entente Cordiale, and he also enforced a non-interventionist policy aimed to avoid large-scale European conflict, which was a significant contrast to the turbulent Napoleonic years. France supported the constitutional governments in Spain and Portugal and aligned itself with liberal movements abroad, and these diplomatic efforts helped to maintain relative peace in Europe while still maintaining French influence without war during much of Louis Philippe's reign. And then, despite the non-interventionist policy, France did experience some military engagements. However, these were all centered around their colonialism, with the conquest of Algeria being a notable one. And so Louis Philippe's reign saw moderate but significant reforms aimed at stabilizing France after the July Revolution of 1830. These included expanding suffrage slightly, but it still excluded the mass majority of the population, with only 1% being able to vote. Infrastructure improvements, such as the expansion of the railway system and urban development projects, helped modernize France and stimulate economic growth. And then the economy was dominated by the bourgeoisie, who supported Louis Philippe because he represented their political and economic interests. This class consisted primarily of business owners, bankers, industrialists, and wealthy professionals, and they wielded significant influence over government policies. Under Louis Philippe, the government encouraged industrial expansion, banking, and infrastructure development, leading to prosperity for this class. However, this dominance contributed to increasing class tensions, as the working class and rural populations felt excluded and marginalized. And so, political power under the July monarchy remained largely out of reach for the working and lower class. There was a lot of rapid industrial growth, but workers still faced long hours, low wages, and unsafe conditions. The exclusion from the political process and economic prosperity deepened the social divides and laid groundwork for social unrest. Additionally, political tensions under Louis Philippe also arose due to competing conservative and liberal ideologies. Conservatives favored strong royal authority and were dissatisfied with Louis Philippe's liberal policies, whereas liberals wanted more reforms, expanding suffrage, as well as civil liberties, which the monarchy resisted. And so Louis Philippe, his guiding philosophy was to follow the just middle, not going to the liberals or the conservatives, and he struggled to balance the two sides, leading to the ideological conflict that contributed to the instability that eventually led to the Revolution of 1848. And then the July monarchy did see rapid industrial growth, particularly in textiles, coal, and metal production. Urban centers like Paris and Lyon grew as industrial hubs, transforming France's economy. Railways expanded, further fueling economic development and internal trade, but the rapid pace of industrialization heightened social tensions because the workers continued to endure harsh labor conditions, with again no political power to seek improvement. And then regarding economic policies, the July monarchy adopted policies that really favor the bourgeoisie, including low taxes on industry and protective tariffs. And so these benefited the industrialist and business elite, which led to further prosperity for them. And it boosted the nation's industrial capacity, but it contributed little to the alleviating poverty among the working class. And then as the middle class grew wealthier and they saw these differences between the bourgeoisie and the working class, the gap between them widened. The urban poor felt increasingly alienated from prosperity, enjoyed by the elites both financially and politically. And in rural areas, poverty pushed many into cities, increasing the number of unsatisfied urban workers. And this is where we start to see a problem with, despite his initial popularity and intent to lead in the political middle, Louis Philippe faced growing political dissent from both conservatives and liberals. The monarchy's censorship and repression of dissent only fueled more opposition, and his policies favored the bourgeoisie, frustrating the working class. And then, in addition to this, the discontent by the people, intellectuals such as Victor Hugo and Alexis de Tocqueville became critical of Louis Philippe's regime. Hugo was initially a supporter, but he grew disillusioned with the monarchy's repression of the poor and failure to implement meaningful reforms, whereas Tocqueville highlighted the dangers of growing unrest in his works on French society. These thinkers influenced public opinion and helped galvanize support for Republican and democratic ideals. By the mid 1840s, France experienced severe economic crisis marked by poor harvests, food shortages, and rising unemployment. This downturn hit the working class the hardest, fueling widespread frustration. The government's failure to provide relief heightened social tensions, significantly contributing to the revolutionary atmosphere of 1848. And then in February 1848, economic and political grievances led to mass protests in Paris, which quickly escalated into violent clashes with government forces. Louis Philippe abdicated and fled, marking the end of the July Monarchy and clearing the way for a new political order in France. And so, upon his abdication, a provisional government established the Second Republic, which introduced universal male suffrage and laid the foundation for a more democratic system. While the Republic represented a major shift towards republicanism, it still faced internal divisions between conservatives and socialists. And so the Second Republic's formation signified a move towards a more democratic government in France, embracing universal suffrage and greater political inclusion. This transition was pivotal in the country's long-term effect to balance social equality with political liberty. And then Louis Philippe's downfall illustrated the dangers of concentrating power in the executive. The Second Republic aimed to correct this by a more balanced system of governance with checks on authority, as well as setting a precedent for future Republican governments.